In this lesson, let's learn about probability over multiple trials. 複数回の思考による確率の意味。Consider the likelihood of the needle landing upward and landing downward when the thumbtack is thrown. As shown in the illustration, consider which is more likely to occur. Let's look at a table of the results of an actual experiment in throwing a thumbtack and see which is more likely to occur. When we look at whether upward or downward was more likely to occur at each frequency, we found that at 700 trials, the result was upward. At 800 trials, the result was upward. At 900 trials, the result was upward. And even at 1,000 trials, the result was upward. Now we will learn about relative frequency. Relative frequency is how often something happens, divided by all outcomes. Relative frequency is a number less than or equal to 1. The closer to 1, the likelihood of a thing happening, the more likely the thing is going to happen. Now let's actually find the relative frequency at 1,000 throws based on the results of the early experiment. Since the needle landed upward 571 times in 1,000 throws, the relative frequency at this time is 571 over 1,000, which is 0.571. Next, since the needle landed downward 429 times after 1,000 throws, the relative frequency at this time is 429 over 1,000, which is 0.429. When the needle is thrown 1,000 times, the relative frequency of the needle landing upward is 0.571, and the relative frequency of the needle landing downward is 0.429. Thinking about the larger relative frequency, it is more likely that the needle will land facing upwards when thrown 1,000 times. Now let's do an exercise. Find the relative frequencies to 3 decimal places when the needle lands facing up and facing down after 700, 800, and 900 trials, respectively. Press the pause button and try to solve the practice problem. Once you're finished, press the resume button and mark what you got correct. Now let's check our answers. When the thumbtack is thrown 700 times, the relative frequency of it landing facing up is 0.559, and the relative frequency of it landing face down is 0.441. When the thumbtack is thrown 800 times, the relative frequency of it landing face up is 0.554, and the relative frequency of it landing facing down is 0.446. When the thumbtack is thrown 900 times, the relative frequency of it landing facing up is 0.567, and the relative frequency of it landing face down is 0.433. Were you able to answer all 3 questions correctly? Finally, let's review what we have learned. Relative frequency is how often something happens divided by all outcomes. We use relative frequency when considering the likelihood of things happening. Relative frequency is a number less than or equal to 1. The closer it is to 1, the more likely it is that a thing is likely to happen. In this exercise, you found that the relative frequency of a thumbtack being thrown landing face up was higher than it landing face down, no matter the frequency. So it can be said that it is more likely for the needle to land facing up when a thumbtack is thrown. That concludes this lesson.